I've been playing Tekken 8 since its release in January 2024, and I was hooked immediately. I've been a fan of the series since the first entry. I even still have my Tekken 1 disc to this very day. Despite the numerous flaws that plague Tekken 8, I still think there's an excellent game underneath it just waiting to be plucked out by the developers. So in this video, I'm going to highlight the various issues this game has and offer solutions and suggestions to potentially alleviate them. Keep in mind, I am not a pro player by any stretch, but hopefully my experience with the series will shine through in what I have to say. Some of my issues with this game won't be anything remarkable, but that doesn't make them any less important to mention. Tekken has always had a broken versus broken mentality when it comes to balancing, but the key difference that I've discovered with Tekken 8 is that the broken characters are a lot easier to get a grip on than in the past. The usual dynamic with characters was that they were easy to learn and hard to master. Some characters were easier to learn, like Jin, and some were harder to master, like Yoshimitsu, but on the whole, it made the learning curve of Tekken fairly predictable. I don't mean to imply that since Tekken's always been broken, then it should stay broken, or anything of the sort, but it's conventional wisdom that a powerful character should be difficult to play, and vice versa to compensate for it, which, for the most part, is neither in Tekken 8. Characters like Victor, Eddie, Jin, and Anna are low-risk, high-reward characters that get away with a murder on every patch. This is a tough thing to suggest improvements for, though. I'm not a big fan of just adding more inputs just for the sake of it, but I can hardly justify subtracting inputs for the same reason either. Simplification of the series has been talked about all the way back to Tekken 5, then it was a slightly bigger topic in 6, before kicking into high gear with 7, and now we're repeating the cycle with 8. It would be naive to think that these people don't have a point to some degree though. It's easy to just list off moves and see which ones had their input shortened, just for the sake of making it easier to input. Law's Dragon Sign stance is a particularly bad example. In 7, the input to enter DSS was a precise back, neutral, and forward input. In 8, you only have to hold forward to maintain or enter the stance. If you can't see the problem, imagine a world where Electric Wind Godfist wasn't a frame-perfect move, and you'll get the picture. It might be worth explaining why this is an issue in the first place besides leaving veteran players out in the cold. The average character in Tekken has about 90 to 100 moves. Given the sheer amount of variety on offer, it's natural that players will gravitate towards whatever moves tickle their fancy, while some others will be inclined to moves that are more effective than they are flashy, carving out their own sub-playstyle of sorts. That's not to say that you can just play whatever archetype and turn them into something else, but the point is that the quantity of moves lends itself well to player expression. Some of the moves were also intentionally made difficult or the timing tricky to provide a sense of satisfaction once the player got a grip on it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the movesets of the previous games were intentionally convoluted or anything. There were certainly plenty of simple moves to use as well. Even though Tekken 8 has the same amount of moves as before, at least to my knowledge anyway, mastering those characters isn't as rewarding because of how gimped they can feel at times, as though you aren't allowed to express yourself through the character and have to go through the same motions as everyone else, making fights feel more dull and samey than they would have been otherwise. If a character can be more balanced without losing what makes the character fun to play, then I see no reason why you shouldn't, in hopes of making the game more fair to competitive play, but that's not what's happening here. This is clearly being done to appeal to more casual players, which is fine enough, but there's a difference between lowering the skill ceiling and lowering the barrier to entry. Tekken 8 already does enough to ease players into the game as is. The options present in practice mode are astonishingly robust. There are sample combos and challenges, there are recommended moves, there's counter hit training, and even recently they added a training mode to help practice breaking throws. The team should be commended for the sheer amount of options presented for beginner players to get a grip on their character and mechanics, but that just makes me even more puzzled as to why veteran players had to suffer for these options to be available. Frankly, the solution here is fairly obvious to me. If the team isn't keen on reverting these new inputs to their previous version, then the inclusion of legacy inputs is necessary. If you haven't played the game, legacy inputs are essentially the older version of existing moves, which deal more damage and have a blue spark effect on the character to let you know it was done. It would be naive to assume that legacy inputs can done for all of the moves or even most of them, but it is an option that should be considered more often, as the game includes more and more characters from the previous entries. I do think the oversimplification problem does get overblown by the community at times, but it is a genuine problem. Things like one-button input for moves make me worry about future characters and the lengths the team will go to make the game that little bit simpler. If this sounds far-fetched now, keep in mind that these kinds of issues always start small, and I'm only talking about current characters. Another part of the oversimplification discourse is around the comeback mechanics. Tekken 6 started with Rage Mode, which activated whenever a player's health fell below a certain threshold. It was quite tame compared to what would come later, and given the 5% health threshold to activate Rage, the damage boost was nowhere near enough to change the tide of a fight, assuming it wasn't a close call in the first place. Even at its best, it acted more as a gap closer for terrible players and a somewhat slim fighting chance for better ones. Rage drives and rage arts were added in Tekken 7 alongside the threshold for activating rage mode being increased to 25%. Rage drives are a somewhat harmless addition, but rage arts proved to be problematic. Since it absorbed attacks, you wouldn't have to look far to see players often throw it out last minute to secure some bit of damage and even the odds in their favor, or even win the match outright. If you're at full health and got struck by a rage art, which deals about 55 damage, you'll be left at 115 HP from your standard 170. This is not even taking into account that the lower your health is, the more damage you'll deal with rage, which will strengthen the rage art to deal about 82 damage instead. You could argue that the opponent is still at fault for being hit by the rage art in the first place, but the main problem is how demoralizing it can feel to lose a match, or be on the verge of losing a match, purely because your opponent got hit enough times and did a button at a moment you couldn't expect. The only saving grace with the rage arts was that one that missed would leave a huge window for the player to be punished, as it should be. Rage arts were carried over to Tekken 8, which brings forth all the problems I just mentioned, but in the place of rage drives we were given the heat system instead, which brings a whole host of other issues. It would be better to see the heat system as more of an evolution of the meter that 2D characters had in Tekken 7, but here's a key distinction. While strong moves were locked behind meter, they were left empty at the start for a good reason. Giving the characters access to full meter at the beginning of the round would have given them a very strong advantage right out the gate. Now imagine Tekken 7's meter, but every character has it, it refills at the beginning of every round, the input to activate rage can be done twice to deal a lot of damage, especially as a counter, and there are certain moves that not only activate it automatically, but also leave the opponent stunned. It's fairly obvious which one has the poorer implementation, not to mention that Tekken 7 had the sense to give meter to characters who required high execution to make use of the meter in the first place. You could argue that since both players are given heat at the start, this imbalance evens itself out. However, the problem lies in how much it de-emphasizes defense and renders inferior characters with little standing once heat comes into play. Heat Smash had the same issue that Rage Arts had at release, where players would just throw it out willy-nilly to deal some damage at the last moment. The solution here would be to make the damage of the Heat Smash scale with the remaining heat available, so players who activate heat on a whim have little recourse. Additionally, heat can also be used to extend your current combo, which is fine in isolation, but thanks to tornadoes and rage arts, it can make combos feel obnoxiously long as a result. If the team doesn't want to implement all the suggestions I've made, then I see no reason why a legacy mode of sorts, which removes all these comeback mechanics, can't exist. I hate suggesting outright removal, as I believe even the worst mechanics can be worked around in some shape or form, and I think the rage arts do give a lot of personality to the characters, but given how divisive this topic can be, it should be left up to the players, even if I personally believe that the game would be better off without rage. You might argue, in a scenario where this mode got more popular than the main modes, that this might leave Namco feeling discouraged about the implementation of heat and rage, but I would say that that's a good thing. It'll let Namco know that what players actually care about in Tekken are the fundamentals, not the dozen bells and whistles they feel like adding. The developers stated that they want to work towards making combos deal less damage, but what they should be focusing on is making combos shorter. One way to do this is to increase the knockback scaling, since it'll not only make players put more thought into how they extend their combos, but it'll also give a clear avenue to let players know when it's their turn. Knowing when it's your turn in Tekken 8 is a major problem, not helped by the abundance of plus-frame moves, which can unleash a relentless amount of pressure that can leave opponents nervously tossing out counters, which could leave them open for more pressure. It's why comments that Tekken 8 is a casino have been so prevalent. Usually, 50-50s wouldn't be so bad, but given how much stronger offense is in general, it can leave a player desperate to escape, having little recourse besides guessing, which could lead them to taking more damage, which is exactly what they wanted to avoid in the first place. In the previous games, sidestepping was typically a safe way to avoid this, but moves in Tekken 8 have way stronger tracking than they did before. At the very least, they could add some infinite stages to lessen this problem, but those still don't exist in the game, despite being 2 seasons into its lifespan. The strong offense of the game isn't helped by the absurd, overly flashy animations that can overwhelm the player in a completely different fashion. The best and most used example is with Lars, whose speedy attacks and anime-style animations can make it really difficult to tell when there's a right time to attack and when's the time to keep blocking, which is probably why he and Elisa are so attractive to button mashers. I'm not 100% keen on this position myself since Tekken stopped deviating from its grounded aesthetic ever since Tekken 3, but when the problem is visual clutter, the excuse can only take you so far, especially when it's compounded by the constant 50-50s, which can make getting hit feel particularly unfair. If you want the greatest example of how Namco has been more concerned with bolting new mechanics instead of refining the existing ones, it's the install mechanics. Installs are basically a buff or charge state that certain characters can enter either by doing certain moves or by activating heat. Certain characters in the past, like Claudio or even Brian, had something akin to installs, but this is the first time we've seen it implemented in a more complete form. The most obvious issues with the installs is that not every character has it, and the ones that do already have a massive edge once the mechanic comes into play. For example, with Heihachi's warrior state, once he has activated heat 3 times, he'll turn into what is essentially a boss character at the final round with no drawbacks. You could say that installs could help the developers give certain poor characters a helping hand that would act as a temporary safety net until a future patch. But that's pretty self-defeating when the character tiers are constantly changing and you'd be hard-pressed to find an outright bad character in Tekken 8 already, not to mention that the characters selected to have installs seem arbitrary more than anything, and I think the game would be better off without it. I won't be discussing the characters individually as we'd be here forever, but suffice to say that I have one concern about how the cast should be handled in the future. The amount of stances crammed into every character besides a select few is downright laughable and is chipping away at what makes these characters appealing to certain players. Imagine if every Street Fighter character had 2 to 3 special moves that revolved around zoning the opponent. Grapplers and rushdown characters probably won't feel very good if their main slowly turned into someone that wasn't them anymore. I can forgive Reina since she is a new character and I think that allows the developers some leeway in giving her whatever playstyle they want. I can forgive Yoshimitsu and Steve for the same reason. Their offense always revolved around stances. But given the amount of 50-50 mix-up stances that other characters got, it can feel pretty discouraging to learn a character and see that their offense now revolves around it as well. I love the stance-based offense in Tekken since it not only reinforces the martial arts theme, but can make certain characters really satisfying to learn. But that satisfaction is taken away when you learn that most other characters also have a couple of stances that need to be learned as well. I'm not asking Namco to remove these or anything, but if the game is going to include more and more returning characters, I'd rather the team focus on these characters' strengths and not use stances as a crutch to artificially make the character harder to learn. Since I'm done talking about the game itself, I'd like to touch on the community for a moment, which is just as important when considering ways to improve the balance. The community is extremely divisive in providing feedback since their mains will either be downplayed to oblivion or they will actively prop up other characters to avoid drawing attention to how strong theirs is. A clear example is when pro players during Tekken 7 tournaments were adamant that 2D characters like Akuma were overpowered. Yet, he was rarely seen in competitive play because he took a high amount of skill to get good with, but that won't be the part that you hear. You'll just hear that he's overpowered and that he needs nerfs. Another example is when patch 201 was released, which featured a ton of damage and chip damage nerfs, which is exactly what the game needed. Despite the patch being nothing but a good step in the right direction, it was met with tons of hate online, with various players complaining that their mains got nerfed. It's damn near impossible to get the game in a healthy state when so many players are constantly pulling the development team in several different directions instead of swallowing their pride for the sake of seeing the game get better. I don't mean to imply that the fan base is solely responsible for the game ending up the way that it is. That responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of Namco, but it is problematic in terms of feedback. Another bad omen for the game's future direction is how the team responded to people voicing their strong hatred for the game's state at the beginning of Season 2. Where many of the issues I discussed in this video were cranked up to 11 amongst other problems. I think it goes without saying that you need a certain kind of humility to have a job like this. Sticking your head in the sand and blocking various well-known players, instead of responding with equally constructive comments, isn't the way to go. Namco's handling of the game post-launch also hasn't been the best either. I would understand not wanting to push out updates at a faster rate if the game were in a good state to begin with, but as I've discussed up until this point, the game obviously isn't. One counter-argument is that even if the game were in a good state, then the team would want players to get a good feel of the individual balance adjustments before they start working on the next one. Fair enough, but if you've already made your goals towards balancing clear, I don't know why it would take you longer and not shorter. The way Namco have handled announcing the DLC characters has also been less than stellar. I used to think that revealing the characters individually was the better choice since it allowed the marketing team to build up some anticipation. But that's a double-edged sword when the character turns out to be a character no one wanted, and that anticipation will soon turn into anger. Not to mention, it can feel scummy towards people who purchased the whole pass ahead of time and have to deal with characters they didn't want or weren't interested in. While I'm on the topic, I think it would benefit Tekken 8 a lot to have DLC characters be available in the practice mode for players to lab once the characters are released to the public. It might make the DLC characters easier to pirate, but if you ask me, that's a worthwhile trade-off for such a massive quality of life improvement, especially when the pirates get access to the DLC anyway. The amount of anti-consumer practices Tekken 8 has up its sleeve is appalling, but I doubt they will get rid of the Tekken shop anytime soon, unfortunately. Another potential problem with the DLC characters is how the team will handle highly requested ones being added to the game. For example, in Tekken 7, Lei Wulong was a highly requested character who was eventually added to the game, and even though most people voiced their desire to have him back, he was one of the least played characters in the game. I have seen several people wanting Namco to add Miguel to the game, and while I think Miguel is a cool character, the cynic in me can't help but feel that even if he was added tomorrow, he would be nothing but a waste of a character slot, and most people who requested his return simply did so for the novelty of having him back. I suppose the best way to tackle this is on a case-by-case basis and see which ones seem genuine and which ones seem to just be requested for the sake of novelty. That concludes this video on how I want Tekken 8 to move forward, both as a game and as a competitive one. Even if none of the issues I discussed in this video get taken care of right away, or even in the coming weeks, that's fine. It's always important to remember that balance is always an active effort and always ongoing, and Fakamuran proves to me that the team can be talented in how they balance the cast. I know that most people probably won't even see this video, let alone care enough about my opinion to give it any credence, but I still felt it was worth saying. It hurts to see how Namco have treated this game as a hardcore fan of the series, and it hurts even harder as someone who sees the extreme amount of missed potential of Tekken 8 and seeing none of it get realized yet. I understand by the very nature of the game I'm discussing that some of these issues will get outdated in the near future, but I would argue that that's a good thing, since it means that my criticisms were addressed. Whether it was for better or worse remains to be seen. I suppose the only way to know for sure is to just sit and wait.